Ever wondered what a centuries-old religious text has to do with your favorite single malt scotch? Well, it turns out a lot more than you might think. We're about to dive into how a single change in Spanish law created this incredible clash between ancient tradition and the modern whiskey industry.
You know, when you think about it, Scotch whiskey is super simple. The rules are strict. It's got to be made in Scotland, from just cereals, water, and yeast, and aged in oak casks for at least 3 years. That's it. So, what's there to even debate? How on earth could a drink this pure get tangled up in such a complex religious argument?
Well, the answer isn't in the spirit itself. It's not the grain, not the water. The entire controversy, all of it, boils down to one thing: the wood. Yep, the barrels. More specifically, the casks that once held Spanish sherry. That's where this whole story really kicks off.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll get the key terms straight. Then we'll look at how things were done the old way, before 1986. We'll hit that pivotal year and see how everything changed, and then explore the new way of doing things. After that, we'll see why the rules had to be rethought, which brings us right up to the debate as it stands today.
All right, let's dive into Section 1. To really get what's going on here, we've got to understand a couple of really important concepts from Jewish law.
So the big one is a concept called stam yanam. It basically refers to any grape wine made or handled by non-Jews. Now, for very old historical and social reasons, Jewish law put some pretty serious restrictions on consuming it. So right away, you can see how any product that might contain even a trace of this kind of wine, well, it's going to raise some questions.
And listen, we're not just talking about any old table wine. We're talking about sherry. Sherry is a fortified wine. That means they actually add brandy to it, which cranks up the alcohol and makes the flavor way more intense and concentrated. And that little detail, it's going to be absolutely crucial as we go on.
Okay, on to Section 2. Now, for a really long time, this whole thing wasn't a big deal. The kosher status of sherry-aged whiskey was pretty much widely accepted, but, and this is a huge but, that acceptance was based on an industrial reality that frankly just doesn't exist anymore.
So back in the day, before the 1980s, sherry was shipped from Spain to the UK in bulk, in these things called transport casks. Think of them like shipping containers. These weren't fancy barrels, their only job was to get sherry from point A to point B. By the time they were emptied and sent up to Scotland, they were old, sometimes rinsed out, and pretty much dry.
And this brings us to another really important legal idea. You've got lifgam versus lishvach. Lifgam means a negative flavor, an unwanted taste that kind of spoils things. And that's how people saw the faint hint of sherry from those old dry casks. But today, it's the complete opposite. The sherry flavor is lishvach, a desirable, positive taste that makes the whiskey better. The whole perception has flipped. So, what happened? How did we get from a negative flavor to a positive one? Well, here we are in Section 3. It all comes down to a single law passed in Spain that completely turned the Scotch industry on its head and set the stage for the debate we're having right now. Okay, check out this timeline. Before 86, there was a steady, plentiful supply of these cheap, used transport casks. No problem. But then, bam, 1986, Spain passes a law saying all sherry has to be bottled in Spain. Just like that, the river of empty casks flowing to Scotland completely dried up. It was a massive crisis for the Scotch industry.
So on to Section 4. What happens when there's a crisis? Innovation. The Scotch industry had to come up with a whole new system, and what they created was a totally new kind of sherry cask. This wasn't a leftover byproduct of shipping anymore. This was a purpose-built tool designed for one thing: flavor.
So check out how this works now. A distillery in Scotland will literally order a brand new cask from Spain, made to their exact specifications. That new cask then gets seasoned with sherry for up to 2 years. But here's the wild part. When they empty it for transport, as much as 30 liters of sherry has already soaked into the wood. And on top of that, they often leave another 5 to 20 liters just sloshing around inside to keep it wet. These casks arrive in Scotland just dripping with sherry, and they're filled with whiskey spirit almost immediately.
And the effect of all this? Get this. According to whiskey expert Dr. Bill Lumsden, that sherry can account for up to 75% of the whiskey's final flavor. We're not talking about a subtle background note anymore. This is the main event. It's the star of the show.
So let's just put it side by side. The difference is night and day, right? We went from old, dry, byproduct casks giving off a flavor people didn't even really want, to new, custom-built, intentionally wet casks designed to create a dominant, positive flavor. The entire industrial reality has been turned on its head.
And this fundamental shift forces us to ask a really critical question, which brings us to Section 5. Can the old legal rulings, which were based on the reality of dry transport casks, still apply to these new, sherry-saturated custom casks?
Let's look at one of the key rulings people often point to. It's from a really famous authority, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, way back in 1948. He was asked about American whiskey, where a small amount of non-kosher wine was added. He permitted it, arguing that the wine became so diluted that you couldn't even recognize a wine taste anymore.
But you see the challenge here, right? Can that same logic, which was based on adding a tiny amount of regular wine, really apply to aging a spirit for years in a cask that's saturated with concentrated sherry with the express purpose of making it taste like sherry? The facts on the ground are completely different.
And what's really fascinating is that another major authority, the Minshat Yitzhak, kind of saw this coming. While he permitted whiskey based on the old transport casks, he added this huge condition. He said if the sherry flavor ever became readily identifiable, the whiskey would be forbidden. And many argue that that time is now.
All right, last section. So, given this new industrial reality and a fresh look at the sources, where do things stand today among the major kosher certifying agencies?
Let's just fact-check some of the old arguments that are still used to permit these whiskeys. The claim that casks sit unused for a year, making them inert? Fact-check? False. They're used in under a month. The argument that the flavor is a negative flaw, or lishvach? Fact-check? That was true for dry casks, not for these modern wet ones designed for lishvach. The idea that they're koshered on arrival? Nope, they're filled immediately specifically to keep that powerful sherry influence.
And this leads to a pretty practical conclusion. Based on this new understanding of the industry, virtually all of the major kosher certifying organizations now state that whiskeys aged in these modern first-fill ex-sherry casks are not approved for kosher consumers. The facts on the ground simply change the ruling.
Ultimately, this whole thing is so much more than a story about whiskey. It's a fascinating case study that leaves us with a much bigger question. In a world where industry and technology are constantly evolving, how do ancient legal systems adapt? How do we ensure the rules apply to the world as it is, not as it once was? That's something to ponder over your next drink, whatever you choose it to be.